we at the Institute are delighted to be collaborating with the writers community because this is a beautiful library. It's the biggest English language library in Italy. So we want writers to be part of what we do here, which is a neat bridge into this evening's talk, which is the latest in our Meet the Author series. My great pleasure to welcome Jeannie Marshall to the library at the British Institute of Florence. And we're going to talk about her extraordinary book, All Things Move. But just to get it going, I'll just say 2 words about who Jeannie is. Jeannie's from Canada, moved to Rome 21 years ago. Over 20 years ago. Been living here ever since. We'll talk about that later on. And has been a journalist, a writer of non-fiction of all kinds. And then, not out of the blue, but slightly left field, came up with this wonderful book, All Things Move. And I think we get started, Jeannie. I'd like to invite you just to read a little bit of the book so people get a flavor of it. It's very hard to describe what this book is, but it's lots of things. And so, do you want to go ahead and do that? Yeah.
Funny, it is hard to describe, even for me, even though I wrote it. Although maybe sometimes it's harder for the writer to describe their own book. So this part that I'll read, I've made numerous visits to the Sistine Chapel, trying to find my way into what is it all about. Had a few disappointing experiences. And then finally, on my third experience, my third visit is when I had an experience that made me feel like, okay, it's starting to crack. I'm starting to see where this is going. Okay. I managed to get a seat on a bench under the scene of the flood where I could rest my head against the wall while I looked up. The deluge is the end of the story, the end of the world as Noah knew it. Though this is the last of the sequence of central panels, Michelangelo painted it first. He painted the destruction of the world before painting its creation. He considered himself a sculptor rather than a painter, and art historians speculate that he wanted to warm up before he painted God. I tried to find my way into this image by noticing the details that I had read about before I came to visit. Details such as the white patch in the sky where the plaster fell off in 1797 when the gunpowder depot at Castel San Angelo exploded. Though it's hard to see from below, a woman carries a jug nestled between the legs of a table that she has balanced upside down on her head as she walks out of the water. Michelangelo had a similar jug in his own kitchen. These facts allowed me to focus on a few particulars, providing a way into this part of the fresco. But then as I looked at the people struggling to get out of the water, it occurred to me that they're not survivors, as I had so lazily been thinking of them. No one who isn't in the ark survives this flood. These people are about to die. The water is rising. This image captures a moment when they still have hope. But we know their hope is misplaced because we know this story. In these circumstances, the table and the jug will be useless to the woman who has gone to so much effort during her last moments on earth to carry them with her. The mother and her children will not survive. They don't know it yet, but we do. Everything that seemed important before the flood is now inconsequential, and yet there's a woman carrying a table and a jug. I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. This is what God says in the King James Version of Genesis and the story of the flood. These people have become wicked, he says, and their hearts evil. The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth, says God to Noah when instructing him to build the ark. But Michelangelo doesn't depict these people as God describes them. And instead, we see people emerging from the water naked and vulnerable, helping and carrying each other, rescuing a few practical household items in the hope that their lives will continue and they will need them. It's the artist's sympathy for God's victims that made me see them as survivors before I thought about the story. It's our tendency to identify with Noah and his family, the actual survivors, but this depiction causes us to consider the fear and anguish and even the humanity of the condemned. Seen through half-closed eyes, the deluge resembles a picture that has been partly whitewashed. The world is a picture that God can unpaint at any moment, wrote art historian Andrew Graham Dixon, who seemed like me to be transfixed by these shades of gray. I had read that line before I ever saw the fresco, but now I could see how the artist painted the sky meeting the floodwater in a way that obliterates them both, as it does in reality in the pale light of a storm. He used the same shade for the He used the same shade for the sky and the sea, a pigment made by friars in a convent in Florence from roasted cobalt and glass, and then ground likely by one of Michelangelo's assistants, until it reached this deathly pale blue verging on gray. This panel is more detailed than the other frescoes, and is even harder to see from the ground than most of them. But resting on the bench in that room, looking at the blue grayness of the water, the sky, and the clouds, I thought of a smothering, airless nothingness. The sounds of shuffling feet and murmurs fused into a hum. The movement of people around me changed character and became like a slowly swelling wave that never crests but only dissolves before it swells again. It's one thing to know the story of the flood and another to feel the loss of anything like hope or future, and to sense the blunt force of finality. Annihilation is in the midst of happening in this image, but this is destruction by God, and this image tells us to seek redemption, to change our lives, or we'll soon be dragging ourselves and our useless possessions onto a shore that will not save us. Do it now while there is still time. There's something menacing, wrathful, and angry going on up there, and it feels like a warning. I shivered while I watched my fellow men and women stumbling about underneath, looking up to the ceiling and tripping over each other, looking down to find their way, but missing what's going on above. All these people in the chapel had their own reasons for being there. Some were devout Christians, some were art lovers, some were checking it off their list of touristic sites. I still wasn't clear about my own vague motivations. We all want something from the Sistine Chapel. We want to understand it, but we also want some of its glories sprinkled upon us like holy water. We want to take hold of the messages painted into the plaster to gain some insight into life here on earth and to figure out how to live. We want to be people who have seen the Sistine Chapel. But even our shallower motivations lie on top of something more profound, the desire to see and be touched by greatness and to discern its meaning in our own lives. When we arrive, if we're really looking, we'll see that Michelangelo is not showing us something beautiful, though there is beauty in it, but horror and destruction, the possibility that our worldly concerns are pointless, that if the world ceased to exist, both our most precious and utilitarian objects would amount to nothing. We were nothing and will be nothing, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Michelangelo blends the sea and the sky at the horizon into a void, an unbearable emptiness. Yet to recognize that void is somehow thrilling. As I sat there, head against the wall, and mostly oblivious to the irritation I was causing by taking too much time on the bench, I felt like I'd experienced something essential and terrifying. Thank you.
Well, yeah, it's. I understand it correctly. You
Yes, it's that experience. I'm sure you've all had it in being in a place that has these incredible masterpieces, but they're also crowded places. You think, I'll go next week, I'll go later. And when my husband and I, when we were first coming to Italy, we went to all kinds of things, and we would sort of circle around Vatican City and think, well, later, we'll go another time. And it took me, I think it was 12 years of living in Rome before I finally went to the Sistine Chapel. And it was partly, there were a few things that changed at that time, things that reminded me that time is passing. It's not, my life is not finite. And also my mother had died at that time. And, at first I felt there was a connection, but I unearthed the connection a little bit more as I kept going to the Sistine Chapel and figure out what it was.
Yeah. And having got there, you then, as this piece you just read illustrates, got to thinking of, so what am I actually doing here? Because there's a sort of strange paradox. I think about this a lot living in Florence, I'm sure we all do, between the extraordinary, beautiful artworks, important artworks, world famous artworks all around us, which draw in literally millions of visitors who clog them up and get in each other's ways, which, as you were describing, falling over each other and trying to get a glimpse.
And people trying to push you out of
Yeah, and then what's going on, why, and what are those people actually looking for?
And I think that's a moment that's important. Like when people start to ask themselves, wait a minute, why am I here? What am I looking at? What am I going to get out of it? And maybe even questioning what's so great about it. You can almost, if you can get to that point of being irreverent, I think then you can actually start to see what is so great about it.
That's really important.
But you do have to be able to get to that point where you can question it for yourself.
Yeah. And so that gets us to the title, which is, subtitle anyhow, which is learning to look in the Sistine Chapel, not see, but to look. And that again came out very clearly in that piece, where you finally, by looking at the scene from the flood in a sort of thoughtful and reflective way, you kind of got what it was actually about, and then really started speaking to you in a big way, as comes out in that piece.
Again, it's the same thing. It's because I got to sit, and I often think if that person didn't stand up and I didn't get that seat, I might not have carried on, might not have come back, I might not have written the book that I ended up writing, might not have had all the thoughts that I had. It really was that you can separate yourself suddenly and just, and I almost wish that they understood that better there, because they're always trying to move you out of the room, also move you out of those seats. And during the COVID period, when I went back after they reopened, they had blocked all those seats, so you couldn't sit down. And I thought, so I'm just going to lie on the floor here, and you're going to have to roll me out of here. I didn't. I was tempted.
Because if it becomes impossible, then everyone is losing ultimately, and the whole thing becomes ultimately kind of pointless, I think.
It's such a difficult piece of work to see. It's so big, and to see it in one visit is really almost impossible as well. If you can prepare yourself as well as you can certainly get something out of it. But it's really, the conditions just make it that much harder. And also it's like being in here and it's even higher. If you had to walk around the room, if you had that constantly, it's not comfortable.
And it's just very complex. There's one or two very obvious images, which are, of course, world famous. God and Adam being the central thing, but a lot of the other stuff is not at all clear what's going on. And Michelangelo's artistic choices are not intuitive all the time. So, it needs study, and it's kind of impossible to do. But you did study it, because you went back repeatedly, and it became a thing.
It wasn't a sort of regular visit. I would just go when I had time, and when I felt like I could, and I would read as much as I could, try to learn as much as I could and understand as much as I could about the history, what's already been said, what's already been thought, and what can I now go there, what is in it for me now. And I didn't even talk about it very much at home. I had other work that I was doing, and James would come home from work and say, how's your day, and what'd you do today? But it took ages before I finally said, I keep going to the Sistine Chapel. Partly because I didn't know how to explain it. The obvious question is why? And I thought, well, I'm not really sure why. But once I kind of got a hold of it, I felt compelled to keep going and keep investigating it. And I was always really interested in modernist art. So for me, this was a real diversion. It was a real difference, to see. And I also felt like there was a connection between the modernist period and the Renaissance, because they were really dramatically, they brought in dramatic changes, each of them did. So they're not visually, of course, related, but certainly the energy behind them was very much of a piece, I felt.
But the book doesn't stop at all on the project we've just been discussing, which is to really study the Sistine Chapel ceiling over time, researching, but also with visits to do the looking. But it sparks a whole range of other thoughts and through lines, which the book then goes onto. When we were talking about it beforehand, you described it as being like a weave between different strands. So maybe you could read another bit which would illustrate another part of the weave.
It was actually a friend of mine who was a formal poet, and she's the one who, after she read it, she said, "Oh, you've done a braid. That's what you've done." And I thought, oh yeah, of course I've done a braid, but But I did see what she meant afterwards. It's that there's the big strand is the frescoes and the artwork itself, and then another strand is the historical period that it was being painted in, and then another strand is my weird Catholic family, because I just realized that both the history of what happened at that time, the way that Catholicism changed, it was all very much related to my own family and my mother. And as I said, my mother died just before I started going, and so I started to realize why that was all, why it all felt like there was something familiar going on. So maybe, in fact, I'll read the bit that is about a bit about my family a little bit. Okay, it does feel as though something deep in my history made me reluctant to go to the Sistine Chapel. And now that I've crossed that barrier, it feels as though the same thing compels me to go back again and again. On those rare times I've been able to sit under the frescoes and study the pieces of its narrative, study the visual connections from one part of it to another, I felt like I'm figuring out how the world works and how my world has worked. Something about this place feels intimate and familiar, as though I knew something important about it long before I came to see it, and I have to admit that I did. Since my maternal grandmother was French Canadian, I grew up surrounded by Catholic imagery. She had crucifixes in all the bedrooms of the little Victorian row house in Toronto, where she lived for more than 50 years. She had portraits of the Madonna, including a small one in a frame that she would hold while she prayed. She had a rosary hung over the edge of her dressing table mirror. The first image I can recall seeing of the Sistine Chapel was a picture my grandmother showed me of God and Adam. It was from a famous painting, she told me, and it would be so wonderful to see it. There was such reverence in her voice, as though she was saying how wonderful it would be to see the face of God, something both incredible and quite unlikely ever to happen. My grandmother was born in North Bay at the end of the 19th century. Her family had been in the fur trade for several generations, and she was among the first to leave that world and move to the city, to Toronto. That change alone was enormous. It moved her children into a world that was wholly different from the one in which she grew up. To my knowledge, my grandmother lived her entire 89 years without ever leaving Canada. Seeing the Sistine Chapel frescoes would have been a dream she'd never expected to realize. I believe she used his name, that she said Michelangelo, because that name vibrates for me like a string plucked long ago that continues to make a sound. It has the ring of cultural memory blended with family history, and the way that knowledge passed through the family and the community seems solid and real and emotionally meaningful. I don't remember what she said really, only that she conveyed a sense of awe. I can't even know if her reverence came from what she saw in the picture or whether it was from Michelangelo's reputation. There was something aspirational in it, that maybe one day it would be possible to see it. And wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be meaningful? And like other aspirational things, it seemed to belong to another life, that a person who would one day see the Sistine Chapel would have to be a different person from her, or that if I were to see the Sistine Chapel, I would become a different person. I think about this now that my circumstances find me living down the road from the object of my grandmother's unrequited desire. My mother kept a few culturally Catholic objects like rosaries and portraits of the Madonna, but she left the church sometime after she started having children, when it seemed to her that it was oppressive to women, particularly to her. The only time I saw my mother go to church was when there was a wedding or a funeral. She continued to believe in God, but there was something about Catholicism that she felt compelled to reject in a way that I would only come to understand much later. I'm certain my growing affection for representations of the Mother of Christ come directly from the maternal side of my family, from the fact that my mother was called Mary and that my first name is also Mary, that my grandmother prayed to her image, and that my mother carried a small devotional picture of Mary in her purse. But is there a direct line from that to me on the bench looking at all the people Michelangelo depicted as Christ's ancestors, playing with the children, tending the elderly, combing their hair, sitting and staring out over our heads, and somehow feeling this has something to do with me? The line is there, but it loops and curves over the ocean and across centuries. I've come to see how I'm related to the historical period that produced this work, how so many of us are connected to it. The ripples caused by events of the early 16th century in Europe, the art, the violence, the rupture that would cause Protestantism, the very notion of non-belief are still lapping at our feet. I did have part where I obsessed over all the Madonnas in other museums. So that's what that was related to.
Yeah, and so one of the many themes of the book is a meditation on religion, and your own relationship with religion. As I understand it, you don't have religion in terms of not a faith. You're not a practicing Catholic, but you're in the Sistine Chapel, and you're necessarily looking at a major work of religious art on the ceiling, another one on the wall, and various other things. And you're right in the heart of the Catholic machine in the Sistine. So necessarily the book reflects on religion and your own relationship with it and what sits within the world and within the art.
Yeah, I had to confront all of that because, of course, in Rome and here as well, so much of the art is religious art. And I think you can look at it and see beyond that. But of course, it's so imbued into it. But I still feel like there's such, I mean, I do have respect for people who have faith and who are believers of whatever religion they believe in. But it's also, I felt like this painter, Michelangelo himself, or other painters are so devout that you have to take that into consideration when looking at it. And also I had to consider the fact that my mother, although she had left the church, and so we were not raised in the faith, then what that meant as well, that it wasn't a decision that I made, but it was how I grew up. And of course, it was something that she regretted later on. So I had to take all of that into account while I'm working my way through the narratives of, just the content of what I'm looking at, as well as it's almost hard to describe, as well as how it feels as well, to look at the art that's been made by someone who's such a devout Catholic. So yeah, I definitely had to, and I still feel like that's been a thing that if we hadn't moved to Rome, I never would have really given all of this the thought that I've given it, and now I'm kind of grateful that I have.
Yeah, and I think it's really important because we who live in Florence are also surrounded by fantastically great art, but 90% of it is religious art. And I suppose, now I'm going to talk very personally for a moment, why I particularly like Quattrocento and the emergence of what's now called the Renaissance is that everyone who was doing it, the people who were paying for it and the people who were making it, had no critical doubt about being Christian.
They had no distance from
none at all. They've just emerged from the theocracy of the medieval times, and for sure, when you die, judgment comes, inferno, purgatory, or paradiso, and that's a real thing. And nobody's debating that. That's for sure. And so what happens is that with the humanist agenda is that you get the slight rebalancing that the human experience actually has some value as well. It's not just about waiting to die. Yes. And that's where you get the extraordinary tension that creates the great, extraordinary work of the Renaissance artists.
And also I found the artistry as well, that one of the theologians who they thought was helping Michelangelo, it's not certain exactly who was helping, but one was Giles of Viterbo. And I found that he had all of these interesting ideas about art and scripture as well, and that you couldn't bring the word of God or the message of God directly to people, that we just could not accept it. We would not be able to understand it. So we needed it to be mediated by art. It had to come to us indirectly, and he called it the scripture, the veil of poetry. And I found that kind of convincing in a way, that I thought it was an interesting way to look at it, because we do have those experiences where it's like your rational brain isn't going to help you to understand it, but you do have some sort of an experience and an understanding of what you're looking at beyond the content of what it is.
And then to move into your brain a bit further, when you were spending a lot of time in Sistine Chapel and your neck got sore, you looked horizontally, and there was another big painting on the altar wall, yes. the Last Judgment. Now something happened between the ceiling and the Last Judgment wall. Do you want to talk about that and maybe find a reading?
So that's, of course, the Protestant Reformation. And so, isn't it? It's 1512 when Michelangelo finishes the ceiling, and it's 1517 when Luther famously comes up with his 95 Theses against indulgences. The longer title, but it shortened it. And so that creates this whole questioning and all of this doubt and all of this violence as well that occurs in between, so that by the time Michelangelo comes to paint the Last Judgment, he's a different person, and he's worried as well about the assumptions that he made, because you realize, of course, then that the church in Rome was so cut off from the church in the north, even though they were going around selling indulgences so that you would get a free ticket basically through purgatory and pass through onto heaven. And they were using it to raise money to rebuild St. Peter's for other things as well. Also the wars that were going on, the Catholic wars. So they were not completely understanding the anger that was coming at them, that was possible to be directed at them. So they didn't take Luther seriously at first, and then he became a huge threat. And because of him and because of the Reformation, of course, the Catholic Church had to kind of double down on its own doctrine, and became, to me, I feel like the church, the Catholicism that was being depicted in the ceiling is the Catholicism of Giles of Viterbo, the way he described it. It's about art and about these religious feelings through art, whereas later on it becomes about sustaining the institution more than about the actual spirituality. Although the Last Judgment doesn't do that, but you can certainly see that those cracks are starting to happen. And I felt like the church that kind of came down that my mother felt was oppressive was the church that was in response to the Reformation. Should I read? Well, actually, the part I found kind of interesting, the part I thought I would read is actually tells you where the title of the book comes from as well. And so it's later, but it's, Giordano Bruno, whose statue is in Campo dei Fiori in Rome. So it's partly about what happened afterwards. Although Giordano Bruno and Michelangelo had a lot of the same influences. Okay, so this is just a description of a day when I was running errands through Rome, taking the bus. So that's why I mentioned that I'm on the bus. Okay, the bus passed a large stone marker along the river that notes when the embankment was built up. It took me a long time to understand why it said Anno Quattro. A friend pointed out that it was built under Mussolini in the fourth year of fascism. The fascist government was so convinced of its mission and of its strength, of its own goodness, that it renumbered time. As I read the contemporary fascist and anti-fascist curses scrawled on bridges, walls, and roadways in the heart of Rome, I felt like something was about to break. All these angry threats of annihilation, each against the other, betray attention. There were soldiers with automatic weapons in the metro and armored vehicles placed in the pedestrian areas to prevent anyone from using a car or a truck as a weapon in a crowd. The streets of Rome had changed with the arrival of thousands of refugees from Africa and the Middle East, people fleeing violence while they were simultaneously being perceived as a threat to the cultural order. I got off the bus and walked through the Roman ghetto, past the armed guards outside the synagogue, toward an art supply shop where I could buy watercolor pencils for Nicholas's school kit. I also had to buy a book as a birthday present for his friend. These were errands, simple tasks that I could tick off the list that I kept in a plain black notebook in my purse. I had only bought the notebook recently and decided to devote it to daily lists in another attempt to be grounded and practical. When I write out my chores in the morning, I imagine I'm making the center hold. I'm preventing the pieces of myself from flying off in the vortex of an ordinary life. I never before understood that stationery could have such salvational possibilities. I make work lists on the left side and household lists on the right, and spend the day keeping them in balance. On my way home, I'll buy a piece of beef and a bottle of wine, as I have reminded myself to do on the right side of the notebook, and I'll rip a couple of laurel leaves off the neighbor's hedge to throw in the pot with the meat, and then I'll make satisfying check marks against the completed tasks and feel like the day was successful. I'll have held off the encroaching chaos, that dimly perceived sense of threat once again. I walked over brass cobblestones placed in front of doorways to indicate that the people who lived there in the 1940s were one day forcibly taken to die in a concentration camp. These stones are all over Rome, but there are more of them in the ghetto. I continued through to the market in Campo de' Fiori and glanced at the dark hooded statue of Giordano Bruno, placed up high and looking over the piazza, who was burned at the stake near that spot in this piazza in 1600. His crime was his belief the universe does not revolve around the human being. God is no fixed point or central government, but rather is poured in waves through all things. All things move. I think of Bruno being silenced, as Heather McHugh writes in this poem called What He Thought. She describes the executioners placing an iron mask over his face so that he couldn't speak. Others have described a spike driven into his tongue or a leather strap tied to his mouth to hold his tongue still. The point is that he had to be silenced since he was known to have been persuasive and eloquent. The spring sky turned gray over Bruno, and the unexpected wind rattled the metal poles supporting the shelters over the fruit and vegetable sellers. There are some days when it's possible to run these kinds of errands through the center of Rome and see it simply as a very old, unique, and beautiful place. But most days I can't help but feel the current of violence, of organized and bureaucratic human brutality. This kind of violence is a measured and considered reaction to something that threatens a perceived sense of order, a reminder of the difficulty of knowing good from evil. I think that's probably enough. So that poem is by an American poet called Heather McHugh. But she used his lines as translated by Ingrid Rowland in her biography. So most of that is actually kind of a reworking of the lines of Giordano Bruno himself. And I thought it was kind of beautiful. God is no fixed point or central government, but rather is poured in waves through all things. All things move. Just seemed like something kind of beautiful. But for someone who was influenced by a lot of the same humanist thinking that influenced Michelangelo, he came to a much worse end.
Yeah.
Things had changed by then.
Yeah, the violence of the Counter-Reformation did not have any tolerance.
No.
Whereas the glorious times of the Quattrocento did. Lots of space to explore new ways of thinking, new ideas. Yeah.
And for me as well, it was the idea that people do such awful things when they think they're doing something good. They felt that to silence, well, I mean, it was a complicated story, but to silence Bruno, people should not hear what he has to say because he could put their souls in danger. So you have to silence him. Yeah. Or, other examples of that happen all the time. And that, to me, was one of the big ones. And also even in some ways, some of the violence that was done during the Reformation was also thought to be, they were doing it for God. Yeah. They thought that the Pope was the Antichrist. Yeah. And so they had to drag him out.
No, there was a huge amount of religious violence throughout Europe for hundreds of years after this, really. Yeah. Actually, I picked out a piece which just one paragraph, which in many ways pulls this all together. Read your book. And it's at the end of chapter 2. And though the popes and their financial schemes effectively splintered Christianity instead of uniting it, though their need for money to finance the artistic revival of Rome brought violence and mayhem, despite everything that was destroyed, it is the art that endures. It is still here, waiting, quietly available to anyone who will only take the time to look. And so that for me is almost a summary of the whole book. I just found that. I thought, oh yeah, that's what this book is about. So I want to just broaden the conversation out a bit. Seriously, the copy's available afterwards. Pick one up. Jeannie will sign it. This is a really fine book. It's about so many things. So beautifully written and so compelling, and it makes you think about all sorts of stuff. But I'm interested a little bit about you and your background, because you came from a very ordinary, in many ways, and complicated Canadian family, and then somehow you found your way to Rome. And I'm just really interested in that transition. Were you a writer before you came to Italy?
Yes, I was a journalist.
Yeah, and then because having moved to Rome, you then go on writing all journalism, nonfiction, all things. But what was the impact of relocating your lives, on a semi-permanent basis, to a completely different culture? How did that play into the way your writing and the way what you were writing about, thinking about?
Well, I think at first, James, my husband, he and I were, he was also a journalist as well. And we were both interested in being in other places, other cultures. And James spoke Spanish very well. And so, in fact, we'd gone to Spain the year before, and I took lessons and spoke Spanish very badly. And then he had an opportunity to come and work in Rome. And he thought, oh, let's go for 2 years. It would be great. You know, we thought, yes, of course, 2 years would be wonderful. And it's been almost 22 years now, so we've stayed. But it did change for me because I had a job at a daily newspaper at that time, and so I left and I continued to work freelance. But there's only so much I could do for a Canadian newspaper from Rome. And there's another newspaper, and they actually have a correspondent here who's a friend as well. So, but he's the sort of guy with the job. I was the freelancer, so I would just do stories that interested me, and I would write sometimes some literary nonfiction that, of course, pays you not very much. It was, yeah, I heard a snort there. Yeah. And then we had a child as well, and I did a lot of editing because that was something that was easier to do while being at home. Journalism, I tried to do some journalism when our son was little, and things would happen where you've got the babysitter and the person you're trying to interview is late, and it was just so stressful and difficult that I took on the editing instead. But I kept trying to write pieces, smaller pieces, and I felt like I wanted to write, I ended up writing a book that was actually about food and children and food cultures. And I used a lot of experience with my son growing up in Italy and going to Italian schools. And what he learned, it was critical as well as being favorable, though. And that was more of a journalistic kind of book, though. And so by the time I had the kind of freedom to write this book. My son was older. I spent a few years on this book. And it just seemed to come. I almost feel like I wrote it in a trance in a strange way. It was like it just kind of, I couldn't stop it. I kept thinking, who's going to care? You know, if I write this book, and I didn't tell my literary agent that I was working on it because I thought she would kill me. So I just thought she's not going to care about it either. And one lucky break that I had is that I got a fellowship for 1 month, and it was in Banff, Alberta, at the Banff Center for the Arts. And it was 1 month where they kind of, they give you it's like being a student where they give you a card, all your meals are taken care of, you're given a studio to write in, you're with 8 other writers, you meet once a day and have a chat. Because it's the mountains, they make you hike and walk a lot, but that was also good for us. And it was such a different environment. I'm writing about the Sistine Chapel and Renaissance art in the mountains, which was so strange. And all the other writers, they were all very kind of athletic people and so different from me. But it was actually kind of fun because I have to read more work with them. And many of them kept saying, I'm learning a lot from this. And I thought it kind of gave me encouragement, and their interest in it gave me encouragement, I guess. And so that was where I got most of the first chapter is what I did in that fellowship. And that gave me the push. And it also gave me, because it is isolating, as you know, there are other writers in the room. It is isolating when you're working on something by yourself, and you just don't know if when it comes out of your head, is anyone else going to care? Is anyone else going to be interested? So finally getting to that point was a huge help. And
you said it took a few years to write the book.
Yes.
It's like 4 or 5 years, or
so I guess let me see now, maybe 3 years, 3.5 years. Yeah. And then of course I finished it just as COVID.
Right. So it's finished in 2019 sort of thing. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and that ties. There's a reason why I'm going in forensic into timelines here. That ties in with your earlier remark that you'd been living in Rome for about 12 years before you went near the Sistine. Because one of the things I was getting when I was reading this, because I've lived away from my home country most of my life, and I've lived in Italy a lot, but other countries as well. And so I'm intensely interested in the experience of biculturalism, of being a foreigner in another land and all that. And so what I find is that And you also just described that, you didn't mean to stay in Rome for 20 years. It's kind of happened. And then motherhood happened as well, which kind of became a big thing for a number of years. And what I think I'm finding in this book is that the experience of learning to look at the Sistine and finding something there released a huge amount of stuff about identity and about place and about that 12, 15-year experience you just had, but hadn't perhaps really thought about or explored properly. And that this is what this book does.
Yeah, it gave me that chance to actually explore it in a way. That's true. Because sometimes you're just living your life. You're just going along day to day. And every now and again you think, oh, here I am, I'm saying something in Italian. How strange. I didn't know Italian a while ago. And or that, you have to kind of come to awareness and realize that you're living in a place that isn't yours. That is, we were adults, married already by the time we came. So we were not young when we came here. And it is, it definitely gave me that chance to think about it. And also just to think about how strange it is as well. The way that life can take you from one place to another. And I do talk about my family a bit in the book, but I'm the youngest in a large Catholic family that had a lot of problems and also financial problems because my father died as well. And so my mother had to try to pull everything together. And I was the only one who went to university. And I think it was partly, my brothers always say it's because I was the youngest one. I didn't have, their experiences were harder, I think, than mine was by the time I came along. But that experience alone changed my life. It meant that I was suddenly able to work in different places. I got a literature degree and a journalism degree. And I was able to be a journalist, and that meant I could travel. And then before we know it, we're
here you are. Yes.
Rome all these years.
I'm sure everyone in this room can relate to that because I think all of you guys live here on a pretty, but either for a long time or certainly on a permanent basis. Yeah. Sure. Because I'm going to throw it over. Is there anything you guys would like to ask Jeannie and to pick up in this conversation? Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, nice to hear about your book. The book seems to be like a mixed genre. Did you struggle with that, or did it just come that way? Because obviously there's a strong memoir element to it, as well as the art history, and I see that there are photographs in the book as well.
Well, I just thought of it as literary nonfiction. So I didn't really think about it necessarily as memoir, although it does have a component of that. And I think because of my journalism background, the funny thing about journalism is that it gives you this strange confidence to write about anything, because you don't have to be an expert but you need to consult the experts and you need to gather the material, but you're not going to write about it in the same way that an expert would write about it. And there is value in that, I think, in telling a story that isn't from the perspective of the art historian. Those are, of course, we need those stories. We need the people who do all the academic research. And those are all great. I read some fabulous books as well. But I feel like you can take all of that material and then you can make it your own and write about it in that way. So in fact, it did become difficult because, of course, they have to categorize the book to put it on the shelf, right? And so they put some in the art history, some in the memoir, some are even in the travel section in the bookstore. It's really funny. But I thought, okay, I'm actually pleased with that because it does mean it covers a lot of bases. And I think when you actually get down to writing anything that feels real, it's complicated. It's always going to be complicated. But you need to tell the story in a way that makes sense so that people aren't confused while they're reading it. But it doesn't necessarily, I often find when I'm trying to fit my work into a preconceived pattern that it feels false sometimes. So I need to break it. I've just about finished writing a novel, and it's not a very strange novel, but I felt again like I had to break it a little bit. I had to break the pattern to make the story feel real, I think.
Microphone? No? Okay, I've got lots more to talk about.
You ask.
what I wanted to explore a bit was that, I mean, this book we've explored a lot, and you're absolutely right. It's got history, it's got art history, it's got appreciation, it's got sociology of what's happening in the streets of Rome. It's got your own family memories. It's an extraordinary book, all woven together. But what other things have you written about over the years? You spoke about doing quite a lot of literary nonfiction. What other stuff have you been writing about?
Gosh, well, there was I lived in Berlin for a short time, so I wrote a piece about it was again, it was literary nonfiction, but for a journal called Brick, which is actually it's a great one. Michael Ondaatje started the journal. He and his wife run it. But it was about an experience I had of living in a building and seeing the dynamics that were going on in the people who owned the apartment that I lived in and the people above, and realizing that it was also connected. There was a real tension between a brother and a sister. And I mean, it's kind of complicated, but I realized it was because they were not on the open, but they had been German Jews. And so I realized that was the element there. There was another one I wrote about. It was a weird one. It was about hunger. And I was looking at hunger two ways. And one of them was the hunger for food and sustenance, but the hunger for wisdom and for experience, and how they kind of came together. That's the ones that come to mind at the moment, the ones I'm willing to disclose anyway.
Have you come across Wallace Manozzi up in Parma? Do you know her? No. You should meet her, because she was in this room a couple of weeks ago on the last of these things. And her latest book is all about silence. She's written a whole big book about silence. And in a funny kind of way, they're completely different. They're doing a similar thing about being really meditative, like thinking about all sorts of stuff through one lens or another. Your lens is the Sistine Chapel. Wallace's lens was this idea of silence. Yeah.
It can be a way of telling the story.
Yeah, and then you get to write to like 200 pages about silence.
I'm reading a book now that's by a historian, Modris Eksteins. And he wrote, it's called Walking Since Daybreak, and it's about the Baltic states, but it's because he was born in 1943 in Latvia, and his family had to get out when he was a child, and he has a scar on his head that comes from where he was grazed by an exploding shell as they were. So it's like very vivid, but he is a historian at the University of Toronto, so it's absolutely rigorous academic history mixed in with the actual personal family stories, and it's unusual for an academic to do it, but it's really well done. And he jumps around in time, but you don't ever lose your place. It's actually quite artistic, I think, at the same time. It's really nicely done. Yeah.
Okay, is anyone got any last thoughts? Yes.
You have to forgive the question, because I probably haven't been this.
You need the microphone.
Sorry. I can't remember when the scaffolding was up in the Sistine Chapel. Was that before you were there?
Yes.
So we went up. But I also wanted to say, have you managed to be there alone?
Almost, not quite alone, but it was when, after COVID, it was the second day that it was open in May. I guess it was, no, June, I suppose, after we had the lockdown. And then it was the first few days when it was open. So I think there were fewer than 20 people in the room. So it felt like almost being alone. And also you could see that the guards were also a bit overwhelmed as well. And they gave people a bit of space and didn't shove people. Well, there's no need really to shove people out of the room, but you could also look around and see that it was a special experience for everyone in there, which was nice.
Because you don't have the low periods.
Really don't. Well,
Empty.
one day, rainy day at the end of January, a few years ago, I went, and that was pretty good. That was as close as you're going to get.
Yeah, I used lockdown to get half an hour alone with Botticelli at the Uffizi. So same idea.
Yeah, just kind of going off a previous question about journalistic storytelling. I'm a student here and exploring a career in that field. And I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on kind of how you approach telling other people's stories and honoring the subject in that, and then also incorporating your own experience into that. Just if you had anything else to say there.
Yeah, well, it is hard, of course, and I think you have to be respectful if you're telling stories that involve other people, but all stories do. Like essentially, we're all kind of connected, so there has to be probably caveats to a certain extent. But even in this story that I'm telling in this book, it's it does involve my family as well, and so I wrote it figuring it's mine, and then I let some of them read it to make sure that they didn't disagree, and they didn't, so that was good. But you only have your own perspective, so you have to trust it. And I don't know, I mean, there's so many. I was just in Canada to go to some festivals, and the big discussion at a lot of the festivals, we actually wasn't really aware of this, but I guess there's been a whole spate of writers who have been revealed who are said they were Indigenous, and they are not. And one of them, well, I know that was a few years ago, Joseph Boyden, who won many awards, and actually his books are very good. And a lot of people in Indigenous communities knew that he wasn't Indigenous and thought he did a great job, but also felt that he's getting grants and other things that, and these are not his stories to tell. So that's outright theft, I think. Whereas when you're telling stories that involve other people, I think as long as you do a good job, I think when a lot of the stories that people get upset about, I partly think it's because it's not very well done. That's part of it. And so people do feel offended because they might think, oh, come on, you've totally missed the point, or you've missed, so it's partly even just that the literary work isn't very well done, let alone, the actual, whether you have a right to tell this story or that story. But I think as long as you're asking the questions, then you're probably sensitive enough to not make the mistake.
Any more? We're getting to the natural time to transition. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yes,
Because
it's a beautifully illustrated book.
they're images of the art. The paper's lovely, isn't it?
It's a very beautiful
The
book.
publisher really went all out to do. Yeah, it was because of the photos, and there was only one printing press in Canada that they had to use to get it, the quality, which made it late, but it was nice. But
There's lots of illustrations.
But there's a photographer, he actually lived in Florence for a long time. And I met him in Rome, but he's a fellow Torontonian, which is funny. A friend of ours who was another journalist said, oh, you should meet Douglas because he's living in Rome. And we would get together and talk about, he's also a novelist and writer, a very strange guy, wonderful guy though. But he's incredibly talented. And as we were, as I got to know him, I realized he also took all these photographs, and I was writing this book, and I kept looking at some of his photographs sometimes and thinking they're so related to what I'm trying to do. So I broached the subject of using some of his photographs, and I showed them to the publisher, and he immediately saw the connection. And so he said, yes, let's get him on board. So we made a list of just areas like in the book that could maybe use some kind of illustration with his eye. And so then he took the photographs, and I would go with him sometimes and point at things, and he would photograph it. But part of his technique is he photographs in color, but then he drains color away. And so they're not exactly black and white, but they are mostly. So that there was often a little bit of color. And so the art director who did the cover here, she actually matched the tones that he uses in a lot of the photographs. She drained the color out of Michelangelo's Libyan Sibyl in order to try to match it up and make it the same tone. So I just thought that he's actually got a really great eye, and he just sees Rome in this very interesting way, where he sees the beauty in a lot of the degradation that's going on in Rome as well. So it kind of worked, interestingly enough.
When did he take those before or after the cleaning?
Oh no, these were pictures of Rome. Yes, the ones that are they're just standard photographs of the images themselves, of the artwork, the frescoes. But it's the images of Rome that yes. Yeah,
that's a great point. It's a beautifully produced book. You're very fortunate in your publisher, and actually would make a great Christmas present. It's been a nice book to give. It's a good looking book, but it's also a great book in terms of what's in there.
Messages from people who came to Rome on a holiday and bought the book, took it with them, and read it before they went to see the Sistine Chapel. and then wrote to me, which is really satisfying to have people say it helped. You know, it really helped them to understand not only the Sistine Chapel, but the city itself. So that was very nice. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can continue this conversation over a glass of wine and also over some signing of the books that you may wish to purchase. It just really remains for me to thank Jeannie very much for traveling up from Rome to be with us this evening, and for sharing insights into your gorgeous book. And I think you would be happy to sign copies if people want you to do that. And as always, there's a wine in the other room, so you can go grab a glass of wine and come back in if you want to, and let the discussion continue. Thank you very much. Don't forget to put Laurie if you want to get involved with the writers community.